March 1999, a winding country road in Tennessee, a bottle of vodka, a cell phone, and the greatest voice in country music history slumped over his steering wheel, barely clinging to life. George Jones, the man they called No-Show Jones for his legendary missed performances, was about to miss his final curtain call. The doctors gave him a 1% chance of survival. But somehow, against all odds, the Possum survived, and what happened next would change country music forever. This is the story of the day George Jones almost died, and the remarkable redemption that followed. Long before that fateful day in 1999, George Jones had earned his reputation as country music's most troubled genius. Born in Texas in 1931, Jones began his recording career in the 1950s, quickly establishing himself as one of the most distinctive voices in country music. But as his star rose, so did his problems. By the 1970s, Jones had become notorious for his unreliability. Concert promoters would book him, knowing there was a good chance he wouldn't show up. The nickname No-Show Jones wasn't just a clever rhyme, it was a business liability. His addiction to alcohol and cocaine had become so severe that he would sometimes disappear for days or weeks at a time. There was the infamous incident where Jones, desperate for a drink after his wife had hidden all the alcohol, drove a riding lawnmower to the nearest liquor store. It became the stuff of country music legend, a story so outlandish it had to be true. And it was. Jones himself confirmed it in his autobiography, adding that it wasn't even the only time he'd done it. His personal life was equally chaotic. His marriage to fellow country star Tammy Wynette from 1969 to 1975 produced some of the greatest duets in country music history, but their relationship was volatile, marked by Jones' drinking and erratic behavior. After their divorce, Jones spiraled further. By the 1980s, Jones was in dire straits both personally and professionally. His health was deteriorating, his finances were in shambles, and his once unstoppable career had stalled. But then came Nancy Sepulvado, who would become his fourth wife in 1983. Nancy was different. She wasn't intimidated by Jones's reputation or his demons. She was determined to save him, not just from his addictions, but from himself. Under her influence, Jones began to turn things around. He had periods of sobriety, he became more reliable. His career experienced a resurgence with hits like He Stopped Loving Her Today, often cited as the greatest country song ever recorded. But sobriety was always a fragile state for Jones. By the late 1990s, despite Nancy's best efforts, he had begun drinking again. Not as heavily as in his darkest days, but enough to cause concern. He was still performing regularly, still recording, still the George Jones that fans had loved for decades. But the demons were never far away. The 1990s were supposed to be a time of stability for Jones. He had been inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1992, an acknowledgement of his towering influence on the genre. He was respected by a new generation of country stars who had grown up idolizing him. Artists like Alan Jackson, Randy Travis, and Vince Gill spoke openly about Jones's influence on their music. Yet behind the accolades and respect, Jones was struggling. The country music industry was changing rapidly, embracing a more polished, pop-influenced sound that left traditional artists like Jones increasingly marginalized. Radio stations that had once played his songs regularly now focused on younger artists. Tour dates became harder to book. And as his professional frustrations mounted, Jones found himself turning back to the bottle for comfort. Nancy would later recall that the months leading up to the crash were marked by increasing tension. Jones would disappear for hours, returning home with the unmistakable smell of alcohol on his breath. He would promise to stop, stay sober for a few days or weeks, then fall back into old patterns. It was a cycle they had been through many times before. And then came March 6, 1999, the day those demons nearly claimed him for good. What happened on that Tennessee road would either be the final chapter in a tragic life or the beginning of something entirely new. For George Jones, it would be the moment of truth. March 6, 1999 began like many days for George Jones. He was at his home in Franklin, Tennessee, just south of Nashville. Despite being 67 years old, Jones was still actively touring and recording. In fact, he had been working on a new album, Cold Hard Truth, which would be released later that year. But that Saturday afternoon, Jones wasn't thinking about music. He was restless, and the bottle was calling. Despite promises to Nancy that he would stay sober, Jones had been secretly drinking again. With Nancy away from the house, he decided to drive to a nearby liquor store. He got into his SUV, a Lincoln Continental, with a bottle of vodka already in hand. As he drove along the winding roads of Franklin, Jones was talking on his cell phone with his daughter Georgette. This was before the days of hands-free devices, so Jones was holding the phone with one hand, steering with the other, and occasionally taking swigs from the vodka bottle that he had wedged between his legs. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster struck just after 1:30 p.m. As Jones approached a bridge on Highway 96, he lost control of the vehicle. The SUV slammed into the bridge at high speed, the impact so violent that the vehicle was nearly torn in two. The cell phone connection with his daughter went dead. A passing motorist saw the wreckage and immediately called 911. When emergency responders arrived, they found Jones trapped in the mangled SUV, unconscious and barely breathing. The jaws of life were needed to extract him from the wreckage. The vodka bottle had shattered, leaving glass embedded in his body alongside the severe injuries from the crash itself. Jones was rushed to Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, the premier trauma center in the region. By this time, word had begun to spread through Nashville's tight-knit country music community. George Jones, the Possum, the living legend, was fighting for his life. Nancy Jones was contacted immediately. She had been out running errands when she received the call that would change everything. Racing to the hospital, she was unprepared for what she would find. The man she had spent years trying to save was now in the hands of doctors who weren't sure they could save him at all. As Jones was wheeled into emergency surgery, the prognosis was grim. He had suffered a ruptured liver, punctured lungs, and internal bleeding so severe that doctors initially gave him little chance of survival. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize him, but they warned Nancy to prepare for the worst. Outside the hospital, fans and fellow musicians began to gather. The news had hit the country music world like a thunderbolt. Could this really be how the story of George Jones would end? Not on stage, not surrounded by the music he loved, but alone in a car wreck, the victim of the very demons he had fought for so long. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Jones, who had sung so powerfully about life's tragedies, was now living through one of his own making. The man whose voice had brought millions to tears might now be silenced forever because of one terrible decision. The hours immediately following the crash were chaotic. Reporters gathered outside the hospital, broadcasting updates to a country music fan base that held its collective breath. Inside, doctors worked desperately to save Jones' life, performing emergency surgery to stop the internal bleeding that threatened to kill him within hours. Nancy Jones, who had stood by her husband through so many crises, now faced the very real possibility that this would be the one from which he wouldn't recover. As night fell on Nashville, George Jones hung between life and death. And in that precarious balance, something remarkable was about to happen, something that would transform not just Jones himself, but the final chapter of his legendary career. The first 48 hours after the crash were critical. George Jones lay in the intensive care unit at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, connected to a ventilator that breathed for him. His injuries were catastrophic: a lacerated liver, punctured lung, and internal bleeding that required multiple surgeries to control. The impact had been so severe that his ribs were shattered, with bone fragments threatening vital organs. The medical team was blunt with Nancy. Her husband had perhaps a 1% chance of survival. If he did survive, they warned, he might never fully recover. Brain damage was a possibility. His singing career was almost certainly over. The voice that had defined country music for generations might never be heard again. Nancy refused to accept this prognosis. She established a vigil at his bedside, talking to him constantly, even though he remained unconscious. She brought in a tape player and played his favorite gospel songs. She prayed, and she called on the country music community for support. That support came flooding in. Alan Jackson, one of Jones's biggest admirers, visited the hospital daily. Garth Brooks sent flowers with a note saying, "The world isn't ready to lose you yet. Vince Gill postponed recording sessions to be available for the Jones family. Even Tammy Wynette, Jones's ex-wife, who had her own complicated history with him, called repeatedly for updates. Outside the hospital, fans gathered for impromptu vigils. They brought guitars and sang Jones's songs softly into the night. Radio stations across America played Jones's music as a tribute, many fearing they were providing a soundtrack to his final hours. Inside the ICU, doctors were amazed that Jones was still fighting. His body, weakened by decades of alcohol abuse, somehow clung to life with a tenacity that defied medical explanation. One doctor later remarked, if it had been anyone else with those injuries in that medical history, they wouldn't have survived the first night. On the third day, Jones showed the first signs of consciousness. His eyes flickered open briefly. He squeezed Nancy's hand in response to her voice. Small victories, but significant ones. The medical team began to cautiously revise their prognosis. Perhaps there was hope after all. By the end of the first week, Jones was breathing on his own, though he remained critically injured. He was able to speak in short, painful sentences. And what he had to say surprised everyone around him. He talked about seeing a bright light during his unconsciousness. He spoke of feeling a presence that he believed was God, giving him a second chance. For a man who had spent decades singing about heartbreak and hard living, this spiritual awakening was unexpected. But for those who knew Jones best, it made a certain kind of sense. Beneath the hard-drinking exterior had always been a man of deep feeling, raised in the Baptist church who had simply lost his way. As March turned to April, Jones began the long, painful process of physical recovery. But the internal transformation, the spiritual and emotional awakening, was already well underway. The man who would eventually leave that hospital would not be the same George Jones who had crashed his SUV while drinking vodka and talking on his cell phone. He would be something else entirely. A man with a mission, a testimony, and a second chance he was determined not to waste. As George Jones slowly recovered from his physical injuries, he began to speak more openly about what he had experienced during those days when he hovered between life and death. To the doctors, nurses, and visitors who came to his hospital room, Jones described what he could only call a spiritual encounter. "I saw a light," he would say, his voice still weak but his conviction strong, "and I felt a peace like I've never known before." Jones, who had been raised Baptist but had strayed far from his faith during his years of addiction, believed he had been given a divine second chance. "God wasn't ready for me yet," he told Nancy. "He's got more for me to do." This wasn't just the medication talking. As Jones grew stronger, his conviction only deepened. He spoke of making promises while unconscious. Promises to God that if he survived, he would change his ways. No more drinking, no more missed shows, no more disappointing the people who counted on him. For those who had known Jones throughout his tumultuous career, such promises might have sounded familiar. He had sworn off alcohol many times before, only to return to it when the pressures of life and fame became too much. But there was something different this time, a clarity and purpose that hadn't been there before. Nancy Jones, who had stood by him through so many failed attempts at sobriety, saw it too. "This wasn't like the other times," she would later recall. "There was something in his eyes that was new, like he'd seen something that changed him from the inside out." During his weeks of recovery in the hospital, Jones received visits from ministers and old friends from his church days. He requested his Bible be brought from home and spent hours reading it. He and Nancy prayed together daily. For a man who had spent decades running from his demons, Jones seemed to be finally turning to face them, with faith as his shield. The country music community watched this transformation with a mixture of hope and cautious skepticism. They had seen Jones bounce back before, only to fall again. But even the most cynical observers had to admit there was something profound happening. The man who emerged from that hospital room was visibly changed, not just physically, but spiritually. As Jones prepared to leave the hospital after nearly a month of treatment, he made a public statement that resonated throughout Nashville and beyond. "I've been given a miracle, and I don't intend to waste it. The old George Jones died in that crash. The man who's coming back is going to make things right." The answer to whether his spiritual awakening would last would come in the form of a song. a song that Jones had recorded just before the accident, but that would take on entirely new meaning in the aftermath of his near-death experience. That song was called Choices, and it would become the anthem of George Jones' resurrection. When George Jones finally left the hospital in April 1999, he was a changed man physically, thinner, more fragile, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had nearly lost everything. But it was the internal change that would prove most significant for his career and legacy. Jones returned to the studio as soon as he was physically able, determined to complete the album he had been working on before the accident. That album, Cold Hard Truth, would become one of the most significant of his career, not just for the music it contained, but for what it represented, the rebirth of country music's greatest voice. At the center of the album was a song called Choices, written by Billy Yates and Mike Curtis. Jones had recorded it before his accident, but now the lyrics took on an almost prophetic quality. I've had choices since the day that I was born. There were voices that told me right from wrong. If I had listened, no, I wouldn't be here today, living and dying with the choices I've made. The song was a confession, an acknowledgement of a life lived imperfectly, but it was also a statement of accountability, a recognition that we are the sum of our decisions, for better or worse. For Jones, who had spent decades blaming his troubles on everything but himself, it was a powerful declaration of responsibility. When Choices was released as a single in June 1999, just 3 months after the crash that nearly killed him, it resonated with audiences in a way that surprised even Jones himself. Here was the Possum, the survivor, singing not about heartbreak caused by others, but about the consequences of his own actions. It felt like truth, hard truth, but truth nonetheless. The country music industry took notice. Choices earned Jones a Grammy Award for Best Male Country Vocal Performance and a CMA nomination for Single of the Year. But more importantly, it marked Jones's return to relevance in an industry that had begun to pass him by. But the real story wasn't happening on the charts. It was happening on the road. Jones, true to the promise he had made in that hospital bed, had stopped drinking. With Nancy by his side at every show, he maintained his sobriety day by day, show by show. The man they had once called No-Show Jones now arrived early for performances, clear-eyed and ready to sing. Audiences who came to see Jones in the years following his accident had witnessed something remarkable, a legend reborn. His voice, which many feared might have been damaged by the crash and subsequent surgeries, had actually taken on new depths. There was a gravitas to his performances now, a lived-in quality that made songs like He Stopped Loving Her Today and The Grand Tour even more powerful than before. Fellow artists took notice too. Alan Jackson, who had long cited Jones as his greatest influence, paid tribute to him at the 1999 CMA Awards. When the show's producers tried to cut Jackson's performance of Choices short, Jackson rebelled by stopping his own song midway through and launching into Jones's Choices instead, a public acknowledgement that some voices deserve to be heard in full. The decade following George Jones' near-fatal crash became the most stable and productive period of his later career. The man who had once been country music's most notorious unreliable performer became a model of professionalism and sobriety. The transformation was so complete that younger fans who discovered Jones in these years found it hard to believe the wild stories from his past. Jones continued to record and tour consistently until his final years. His 2005 album, Hits I Missed and One I Didn't, showcased his interpretations of country classics he'd admired but never recorded, while 2008's Burn Your Playhouse Down featured unreleased duets with artists ranging from Keith Richards to Mark Chestnut. In interviews during these years, Jones spoke openly about his spiritual awakening and continued sobriety. That crash was the best thing that ever happened to me, he would say, without a trace of irony. It took nearly dying for me to learn how to live. When George Jones passed away on April 26, 2013, at the age of 81, the country music world mourned not just the loss of its greatest voice, but the end of an era. His funeral at the Grand Ole Opry House drew thousands, with performances by Alan Jackson, Randy Travis, Vince Gill, and Brad Paisley. Today, when we listen to George Jones's music, we hear not just the heartbreak and hard living that made him a legend, but the resilience and redemption that completed his story.